There was a time, not so very long ago, when Chukotka was a name that whispered of opportunity. It was a remote and brutally cold corner of the Soviet Union, a vast expanse of tundra staring across the Bering Strait towards America. Yet, during the prosperous Soviet years, it became a magnet for the skilled and the ambitious. The government poured colossal sums of money into developing this Arctic frontier, driven by the rich seams of gold, tin, and other precious resources buried beneath the permafrost. To get people to move to such an inhospitable place, Moscow offered incredible incentives, huge salaries, long holidays, and the promise of a comfortable flat back in the mainland after a few years of service. It was a tempting offer, one that thousands simply couldn't refuse. Engineers, miners, doctors, and teachers packed their warmest clothes and journeyed to the very edge of the world. They were pioneers of a sort, building a modern society where little had existed before. Thriving towns sprang up from the frozen ground, complete with concrete apartment blocks, schools, cinemas, and hospitals. It was a strange and artificial prosperity, entirely propped up by the state. These settlements were islands of Soviet civilization in an ancient wilderness, populated by people who had come from thousands of miles away. For a few decades, life was good. The shops were stocked, the jobs were secure, and a sense of purpose filled the biting Arctic air. Chukotka was a success story, a testament to the power of state-sponsored development. The region hummed with activity. Giant mining operations tore into the earth, extracting the wealth that funded this grand experiment. The indigenous Chukchi people, who had herded reindeer across these lands for centuries, watched as their world was transformed. Newcomers brought different cultures, different languages, and a different way of life. The population swelled, reaching a peak of around 162,000 people by 1989. It felt as though this remote outpost was finally being tamed, brought into the fold of the modern world. The future seemed bright, built on a foundation of government funding and geological riches. No one could have imagined how quickly it would all fall apart. For those who lived there, it was a unique chapter in their lives. They endured the 6-month-long winters and the constant wind, but they were rewarded with a standard of living that was often better than in other parts of the Soviet Union. Children played in the snow, outside centrally heated buildings, and families enjoyed a strong sense of community, bonded by their shared experience in this extraordinary environment. They were part of a grand project, a bold statement of human endurance and industrial might against the formidable power of the Arctic. It was a golden age, but like all such ages, it was destined to end. The foundations of this northern prosperity were not as solid as they appeared. The dream began to crumble with the Soviet Union itself, as the central government in Moscow weakened throughout the late 1980s and finally collapsed in 1991. The river of money that had sustained Chukotka dried up to a trickle, and then stopped altogether. The generous subsidies, the high wages, the very economic lifeblood of the region, simply vanished. Without the state propping them up, the mining companies faltered. The cost of extracting resources in such a punishing climate, and then transporting them across a continent, was astronomical. The entire system had been built on a logic that no longer existed. The state-run economy imploded, and with it, the reason for these towns to even exist. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The mines, which had been the primary employers, began to shut down one by one. Suddenly, thousands of people who had been lured to the Arctic with promises of security and prosperity found themselves without a job. Unemployment soared to levels that were almost unimaginable. The carefully constructed society of the Soviet era began to fray at the edges, then tear apart completely. People who had built their lives in Chukotka now faced a terrifyingly uncertain future. The state that had brought them here had abandoned them, leaving them stranded on the frozen fringe of a disintegrating empire. What followed was a mass exodus. The non-indigenous population, which had made up the majority, began to leave in droves. They had no family roots in this land, no ancestral connection to the tundra. Their reason for being there was economic, and when that reason disappeared, so did they. People scrambled to get out, selling their possessions for a pittance to afford a plane ticket back to the mainland. The population plummeted at an astonishing rate. From its peak of over 160,000, it began a free fall that would see it shrink by more than half in just over a decade. The once bustling town started to feel hollowed out. This was not a gentle decline, it was a complete and utter collapse. The infrastructure that had been so proudly built began to decay. Without funds for maintenance, pipes froze and burst, power stations failed, and buildings fell into disrepair. The entire region was plunged into a severe economic depression from which it seemed there was no escape. The great Soviet project in the far north was over. The promise of a northern paradise had turned into a harsh and unforgiving nightmare, leaving a trail of broken industries and bewildered people in its wake. The grand social experiment had failed spectacularly. The economic statistics only tell part of the story. For the people who remained in Chukotka during the 1990s, life became a daily struggle for survival. The collapse wasn't just about losing a job, it was about losing the basic necessities of life. Supply chains, which had always been fragile, completely broke down. Food, fuel and medicine, which all had to be flown or shipped in, became dangerously scarce. Shelves in the state-run shops were often bare. People faced the real possibility of starvation and freezing in their own homes. The centrally heated apartment blocks that had once been a symbol of comfort became potential death traps as heating systems failed in the depths of the Arctic winter. Imagine living in a place where the temperature can drop to -40 degrees and the heat suddenly goes off. This was the reality for many. Families huddled together for warmth, burning whatever they could find to stay alive. The once proud towns began to resemble ghost towns, even while people still lived in them. Entire apartment blocks would be abandoned, their windows dark and empty, while a few families remained in a neighboring building trying to hold on. The schools and hospitals that had served these communities were left in a state of crisis. Without salaries, many doctors and teachers joined the exodus, leaving behind a skeletal service for those who couldn't afford to leave. Towns like Leninskoye, once a thriving gold mining settlement, were completely deserted. They stand today as eerie monuments to the collapse, their buildings slowly being reclaimed by the harsh Arctic weather. These are not ancient ruins, they are the relics of a very modern failure. You can walk through streets where children played just a few decades ago and see nothing but silence and decay. The human cost of this period was immense. It was a time of desperation and despair. A long, dark chapter where the future seemed to offer nothing but more hardship. The sense of community and purpose that had defined the Soviet era was replaced by a grim fight for individual survival. The psychological toll was just as heavy. People felt forgotten by their own country, cast adrift in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The vibrant, hopeful atmosphere of the past was gone, replaced by a pervasive sense of abandonment. For the indigenous Chukchi, this was yet another chaotic chapter in a history of outside interference, but for the Russians and Ukrainians who had made Chukotka their home, it was the shattering of a lifelong promise. They had come to the north to build a better life, and now they were trapped in the ruins of that ambition, watching their world dissolve around them. Just as it seemed that Chukotka was destined to fade into complete obscurity and ruin, a most unlikely figure appeared on the horizon. In late 2000, the billionaire Roman Abramovich, a man whose name was more associated with oil, yachts, and later, Chelsea Football Club, was elected as the region's governor. It was a move that baffled many observers. Why would one of Russia's richest men want to take charge of its most bankrupt and desperate region? At the time of his arrival, Chukotka was in a state of total collapse, with government debts that were 4 times the size of its entire annual budget. The task of turning things around seemed not just daunting, but utterly impossible. Mr. Abramovich didn't just become governor in name, he threw himself, and his immense personal fortune, into the challenge. His first actions were a form of emergency relief. He organized humanitarian aid flights, bringing in essential food and medical supplies to communities that had been cut off and were on the brink. He understood that before any long-term rebuilding could happen, the immediate human crisis had to be addressed. He used his own money to pay off the region's staggering debts, effectively wiping the slate clean. This single act provided a glimmer of hope where none had existed for a decade. It was the first sign that things might, finally, be about to change. The next step was to rebuild the region's shattered infrastructure. Over the next 8 years, an incredible wave of construction swept across Chukotka, all bankrolled by Mr. Abramovich's investments. He registered branches of his oil company, Sibneft, in the region, which meant that its huge tax revenues flowed directly into Chukotka's coffers instead of Moscow's. This provided a sustainable source of funding for his ambitious projects. New housing was built, over 100,000 square meters of it, giving people modern, warm, and safe homes. The capital, Anadyr, which had become a drab and decaying town, was transformed with new, brightly colored buildings, a new hotel, and even a cinema. The investment went far beyond just housing. A staggering 18 new schools and 28 medical facilities were built across the region, replacing the dilapidated structures of the Soviet era. He also recognized the importance of preserving the local culture, which had been under threat. He reintroduced the teaching of the Chukchi language into schools and supported traditional reindeer herding. And, in a gesture that captured the hearts of many, he started a program that sent around 6,000 children every year on holidays to the sunny shores of the Black Sea, giving them a chance to experience a world beyond the Arctic tundra. For the people of Chukotka, it felt like a miracle. There is no denying the profound and positive impact Roman Abramovich had on Chukotka. He pulled the region back from the abyss. For the people who lived through the desperate 1990s, his arrival was nothing short of salvation. He brought back heat, food, housing, and, most importantly, hope. The streets were safer, the schools were new, and doctors had the equipment they needed to treat patients. His tenure as governor, from 2001 to 2008, is often looked back on as a second golden age, a time when the region was reborn from its own ashes. The sheer scale of his personal investment was, honestly, unprecedented in modern Russia, a case of one man adopting an entire federal subject. However, the legacy is more complicated than it first appears. The Abramovich era, for all its benefits, created a new kind of dependency. The region's prosperity was once again tied not to a self-sustaining economy, but to the generosity of an external benefactor. When his oil company was sold and its tax registrations moved elsewhere, and when he eventually stepped down as governor, the fire hose of money was turned off. While he left the region in a vastly better state than he found it, with new infrastructure and no debt, he hadn't solved the fundamental economic problem. Chukotka still struggled to pay for itself. The recovery was, in many ways, as artificial as the Soviet boom that had preceded it. Furthermore, while life improved dramatically in the capital, Anadyr, the benefits were not always felt as strongly in the more remote villages scattered across the vast territory. The underlying issues of isolation and a lack of economic diversity remained. The region's economy became heavily reliant on the decisions of large corporations and fluctuating global commodity prices, making it vulnerable to external shocks. The Abramovich boom fixed the most visible symptoms of the collapse, but it couldn't cure the underlying disease of economic non-viability in a globalized post-Soviet world. His philanthropy was a powerful treatment, but not a permanent cure. His legacy is therefore a double-edged sword. He is lauded, quite rightly, as a hero who saved thousands from misery and rebuilt a broken land. The physical evidence of his work is everywhere, in the brightly painted buildings of Anadyr and the modern schools in remote settlements. Yet, his intervention also highlights the region's core fragility. It demonstrated that without massive, ongoing external investment, whether from the state or a billionaire, life in Chukotka is incredibly difficult to sustain. He provided a vital lifeline, but in doing so, he also underscored the fact that Chukotka was, and perhaps still is, unable to stand on its own 2 feet. Even with all the money in the world, one thing Roman Abramovich couldn't change was Chukotka's geography. The region remains one of the most isolated places on Earth. This is not a metaphor, it is a brutal, logistical fact. There are absolutely no roads or railway lines connecting Chukotka to the rest of Russia. None. The only way in or out for people year-round is an 8-hour flight from Moscow to the capital, Anadyr. For everything else, food, fuel, building materials, vehicles, every single thing needed for modern life, the region is almost entirely dependent on ships. This makes its supply line incredibly precarious, hostage to the weather and the short Arctic shipping season. This extreme isolation dictates every aspect of life. Around 90% of all freight arrives by sea, and the ports are only ice-free for a few months in the summer. This means that an entire year's worth of supplies has to be planned, ordered, and shipped in a very narrow window. Any disruption, a storm, a mechanical failure on a ship, or international sanctions affecting shipping lines can have immediate and severe consequences for the people living there. This vulnerability was laid bare in the 1990s, and it remains a constant, underlying threat today. Life is lived with one eye on the calendar and the other on the horizon, waiting for the ships to arrive. The harsh climate only compounds the problem. For much of the year, the landscape is a frozen desert, battered by relentless winds. Travel between settlements within Chukotka is often just as difficult as getting to the region in the first place. Outside of a few local roads around the main towns, people rely on winter ice roads, temporary tracks bulldozed over frozen rivers and tundra, or expensive and infrequent flights on small propeller planes. Getting from a remote village to the regional hospital in Anadyr can be a major and sometimes impossible undertaking. This tyranny of distance means that even with modern facilities, access to them is a constant challenge. This physical separation has a profound social and psychological effect. It fosters a feeling of being cut off from the rest of the world, a sense of living on a remote island. While the internet provides a digital connection, the physical reality is one of confinement. The high cost and difficulty of travel mean that leaving, even for a holiday, is a luxury many cannot afford. This enduring isolation is perhaps the single greatest obstacle to Chukotka's long-term recovery and development. No matter how many new buildings go up, they are still standing on a piece of land that is fundamentally disconnected from the rest of the country. The landscape of Chukotka is haunted by the ghosts of its past. The most visceral reminders of the post-Soviet collapse are the abandoned towns that dot the tundra. Settlements like Yultin and Leninskoye, which were once home to thousands of miners and their families, now stand completely empty. Walking through their silent streets is a profoundly unsettling experience. Concrete apartment blocks stare out with vacant, broken windows. Inside, you might find a child's toy left on the floor, or newspaper from 1993 lying on a table, frozen in time. These places are not just ruins, they are memorials to a shattered economy and the thousands of lives that were uprooted overnight. This legacy of economic fragility continues to cast a long shadow over the region. Even today, Chukotka's economy is precarious, often dependent on a handful of large mining corporations. The well-being of entire communities can hinge on the decisions made in a distant boardroom or the fluctuating global price of gold. This vulnerability was starkly illustrated as recently as 2025. In the town of Bilibino, the Zek mining company suddenly failed to pay its workers. Over 1,000 temporary employees, many of whom had traveled from other parts of Russia for the high wages, were left in a desperate situation. Their dream of earning good money in the north turned into a nightmare. For months, the situation grew more dire. As of August 2025, reports suggested that at least 700 of these workers were still stranded in Bilibino. They were thousands of miles from home with no money and no way to leave. They made desperate appeals to President Putin for help, claiming they were being denied food for refusing to work without pay. This incident served as a chilling echo of the 1990s, a reminder that despite the improvements of the Abramovich era, the potential for crisis is ever present. It shows how the reliance on temporary labor in single-industry towns creates a system where workers have very little power and are extremely vulnerable. These events highlight a fundamental truth about Chukotka. It is a land of high rewards and equally high risks. The region boasts the highest average salaries in all of Russia, a powerful lure for workers from poorer regions. In 2024, the average monthly wage was an impressive 185,000 rubles. However, as the Bilibino crisis showed, those high wages are not always guaranteed. The promise of wealth can evaporate in an instant, leaving people stranded and destitute. The ghost towns of the past and the stranded workers of the present tell the same story, that of a boom and bust economy in a land of extremes. Despite the high salaries and the modernized infrastructure in some areas, Chukotka continues to face a severe and ongoing problem. People are still leaving. The sharp population decline that began in the 1990s has never truly stopped. After a period of stabilization during the Abramovich years, the downward trend resumed. The 2021 census recorded a population of just 47,000 people, a staggering 70% drop from its Soviet-era peak. This is one of the most dramatic demographic collapses anywhere in Russia. It raises a crucial question. If the wages are so high, why do so many people choose to leave, or plan to leave? The answer is that money isn't everything. The quality of life in Chukotka remains low despite the high incomes. The astronomical cost of living eats away at those big paychecks. Almost everything, from fruit and vegetables to clothes and furniture, has to be flown or shipped in, making prices incredibly high. A simple trip to the supermarket can be a shocking experience. Furthermore, the harsh climate, the extreme isolation, and the limited opportunities for leisure and culture take their toll. Many people view their time in Chukotka as a temporary hardship post, a place to earn money before returning to the mainland to live a more comfortable life. This sentiment is widespread. A 2025 study of residents in Russia's Arctic regions revealed that nearly a third of them still plan to move away. They are drawn by the promise of milder climates, better access to healthcare, and higher education for their children, and simply being connected to the rest of the world by road and rail. The high wages are a form of hardship pay, a compensation for the difficulties of living there, but for many, it's a trade-off they are only willing to make for a limited time. The dream is not to build a permanent life in Chukotka, but to earn enough to fund a life elsewhere. This persistent exodus of the non-indigenous population creates a vicious cycle. As more people leave, the community shrinks, services can become harder to maintain, and the sense of isolation deepens for those who remain. The government has tried to counteract this with various incentive programs, but they struggle to compete with the fundamental desire for a less challenging existence. Chukotka's problem is not just about economics, it's about livability. Even a billionaire's investment couldn't fully overcome the powerful human desire for a warmer, easier, and more connected life. The lure of the mainland remains as strong as ever. Today, on the 17th of February 2026, life in Chukotka continues to be a story of contrast and contradiction. It is a land of breathtaking Arctic beauty and profound human challenges. On the one hand, you have the highest median incomes in Russia. On the other, a persistent desire among the population to leave. You have modern, colorful buildings in the capital, standing just a few hundred miles from decaying ghost towns. It is a place where Russia's strategic ambitions for the Arctic, with its militarization and focus on the northern sea route, meet the stark reality of a dwindling population and a fragile local economy. The fundamental challenges remain stubbornly in place. The lack of transport links, the extreme climate, and the high cost of living are constants that shape every aspect of daily existence. The region's economy is still dangerously dependent on mining and government subsidies, making it susceptible to global market forces and political decisions made thousands of miles away. Social problems, such as high rates of alcoholism, persist as a symptom of the hardship and isolation. While crime rates have thankfully decreased in recent years, the underlying pressures on the community are immense. Life here is not for the faint of heart. It requires a special kind of resilience. The future of Chukotka is uncertain. Russia's grand Arctic strategy envisions a bustling northern sea route and new economic projects, but the reality on the ground is one of stalled developments and a shrinking workforce. Even as President Putin prepares to meet his American counterpart just across the strait in Alaska, the people of Chukotka are more concerned with the price of food, the reliability of the next flight, and whether their children will choose to stay or leave. The geopolitical chess game being played in the Arctic can feel very distant when you are struggling with the practicalities of life on the edge of the world. In the end, Chukotka's story is a powerful lesson in the limits of money and power against the forces of geography and human nature. It shows that you can build towns, pay high salaries, and pour in investment, but you cannot easily create a self-sustaining home in one of the world's most inhospitable places. The spirit of the people who do choose to stay, particularly the indigenous Chukchi, for whom this has always been home, is one of incredible fortitude. They live a unique and challenging existence, forever defined by the vast, beautiful, and unforgiving land they inhabit. It is a life on the very edge, in every sense of the word.